Good morning to all of you. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar on the digital negotiable instrument and technology experts for regulatory action task force. We're going to focus this morning for those of you on the US side and in Europe, and this afternoon or evening, I should say, for those in Asia, on digitizing bills of exchange, promissory notes, and looking at the bigger picture of the value propositions for financial institutions, but also for funding platforms, and how, which is all about the technology integration and the regulatory advocacy. This is a webinar that is following a lot of initiatives that have been triggered or delivered at least during this COVID-19 period. Since April, we have finalized the first outcome on the digital negotiable initiative. And we also initiated the TERA, as we call it, task force, which is this task force focusing on regulatory advocacy for negotiable instruments, but also for other topics, as we will see. My name is Andre Kassaman. I'm coordinating the FinTech committee for ITFA. Delighted to be organizing this webinar and welcoming all of you. As usual, we have an expert panel of technologists, business people, legal people. I think the recipe is to combine not only the technology developments, but also the business and market trends with the appropriate legal setups. So it's never just about technology. And this is definitely what we want to deliver to you this morning with the following agenda. As you'll see, we're going to introduce those two efforts that ITFA, the community, worked on over the last few months. We've worked on the DNI initiative since September. We've worked on the TERA task force over the last 3 months with different members of ITFA. And we're going to get inside views from different people on the legal aspects and the technology integration. With this, I'd like to thank in advance our panel of experts for making the time to share their insights during this session. We will record this session in case you cannot attend till the end, or in case you want to share it with colleagues afterwards. So feel free to access the ITFA website in about 2 or 3 days, where you will find the recording of this session. We will have time for questions in live here, so do use the Q&A or the chat for submitting your questions, or raise your hand via the Zoom features so that you can also submit your questions verbally. I'd like first to ask Sean Edwards for introducing himself, because I think some people are discovering also the world of ITFA. So it's good to remind of what we are doing at ITFA, and introducing then the DNI initiative and the TERA task force. Sean, over to you.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you to all of you. Some are very early morning, I know, or a morning or an afternoon or an evening, but thank you all for joining us. I think most of you probably are ITFA members, but just a little bit of background on who ITFA is. We were 20 years old last year. We started in forfeiting, but we've expanded really massively since then, cover a whole lot of different areas. And I guess we cover really the whole of open trade, supply chain, open trade. The two big growth areas recently have been insurance, headed by Cedar Calac, and of course this wonderful FinTech committee that Andre chairs so ably. Now, as part of that FinTech initiative, we've undertaken two initiatives. The one that we're going to talk about principally today is as a DNI, the Digital Negotiable Instruments Initiative. There is also another one that is worth bearing in mind, and we've done a number of seminars and webinars on this, and that's the TFDI, the Trade Finance Distribution Initiative. These things actually, of course, join up, because the TFDI is about distribution. This is more about the origination and creation piece. So we can move to the first slide and just explain what is in DNI. So the idea here, and we'll see how this works in reality, because we are working with partners who've created this, that the ethos very much of it is to think of ideas, but also to come up with solutions. So this is not, what you'll be hearing today is not just hot air. But what this is about creating, as we say here, digitally native original documents. So these are documents that have real value, economic value, and legal value as things, crypto assets, if you like, to use a popular current term, that exist on the blockchain or in some other technology. Now, this technology that we're talking about here and the ideas behind the DNI are not dependent, that it's not critical that you use blockchain, but blockchain actually is the best tool. We'll probably get into that when some of our technology partners and members talk about how it works. But as I say, blockchain, a very good tool, not the only tool. We create these digitally native assets. They are born, they live, and they die on the technology, let's just say here on the blockchain. And the important thing is that because they have the same attributes as the current paper equivalents, so here, of course, promissory notes and bills of exchange is what we're talking about, they also have that quality of transferability. That's what makes them negotiable. And by the way, of course, the same issue and the same advantages exist with bills of lading. We'll touch on that later on. That's an area that we're not particularly active in, but it does touch on what we do. When you create these, and you'll see this when Inigo and Lars talk later on, they are human readable, but very importantly, they are also machine processable. So they're all part of a network. There's no point creating these things if nobody wants to buy them, if banks don't want to hold them, and if they can't be sold on. And I've mentioned the TFDI. What's really important in this space actually is to bring in a lot of non-bank investors, to bring in extra liquidity into the market, and we can create that or help that by actually creating instruments through DNI that look a bit like bonds. They can be cleared in a similar way to bonds. When I'm being sort of poetic, I sometimes refer to these as trade finance mini bonds, because a bill of exchange, a promissory note, is a very simple tool legally, but because of the power of the network, the power of blockchain especially, you can attach a whole load of other utilities to that. Transferability and clearing, of course, very important, but also things like KYC, AML, sanctions checking, and credit ratings as well, of course, all quite easy, or at least technically possible to bring together in one convenient place. So those of you who know me know that my occasional day job is as a lawyer, and I think it's worth pointing out here that actually, thanks to the great work of some of the partners and members that we've got on this webinar, the technology is there, but the real issues that we are facing tend to be legal and regulatory, and I'll go into that later on when I talk about what's going on in the UK, and there are mixed experiences, but there is a theme here that really revolves around the difficulty of reproducing negotiability. So if we can move on to the next slide, because of this problem, we have set up what we call TERA, the Technology Experts for Regulatory Action, and we are acting really as a coordinator, a home for experts in different countries, experts of different sorts, because what we found when we look at the issues is that whilst there is a theme, as I say, there are common themes, the people you need to approach, how you best do that, the particular issues, legal, regulatory, political with a small p, do vary from country to country. So in the UK, for example, I'll talk about later, you need to tackle this at a multi-departmental level. You can't just say, I'll go to the UK government, because the UK government is a lot of different people at this sort of level, and you need to bring them all together, and something which we have managed to do, in fact. but it's taken a long time. In other countries, you need to speak to the right person. And so we need different partners, and those are banks. In some cases, those are supranationals, a very good relationship with the EBRD, and indeed other banking associations, principally the ICC, with whom we have a very good relationship and have been extremely helpful and very effective in the UK especially. And what we hope here is that the governments will make the right decisions, whether that's changing the law, or actually sometimes the law doesn't even need to be changed. It's a question. It's a question of issuing the right circular or directive in certain countries. You don't need to go to primary legislation. And of course, we want pioneers, both banks and corporates, to take up this technology and show that it works. To move on to the next slide. So the areas that we're focusing on, today is mainly about negotiable instruments, but of course, as I've mentioned, this is all part of it's a whole. It's the problems are interrelated, and in fact, what we found, for example, with digital negotiable instruments is that you can do quite a lot of this. So the first circle here, in the UK, electronic signatures, that's not a problem. The problems are different in the UK. In other countries, however, digital signatures, the law around them is not well developed. And they need help, and that's what TERA is trying to do there. Bills of lading, I've mentioned very similar issues. So in the UK, a lot of the work we're doing will also be beneficial to the bills of lading. There, of course, we have our members, SDOCS and Bolero, who are assisting us with getting that through. And of course, they're not the only ones, but they are probably the two leading EBL providers, they've been tremendously helpful. I've talked about the big picture. So what's bigger than the cloud? It sits above us, and it provides the processing power that we need to bring together a lot of this data and at an affordable price. Because I think it's very important to remember also that the technology we're talking about here is not unaffordable. It can't be if we're going to use that in the emerging markets. And for a lot of that, for that to happen, the accessibility and affordability has to be done through cloud. And there are a lot of issues there. Some of those are political with a big P, to do with data localization. One of the early efforts that we made in this area, in the area of advocacy, was at the WTO, the World Trade Organization down in Geneva, to try and push for some of these issues to be dealt with at the level of free trade agreements. And we've had a certain amount of success, but that percolates down. The trickle down of that is actually quite slow. And in fact, cloud, probably of those, is the most difficult because of suspicions about the big cloud-based providers. And so there's in fact surprisingly a lot of resistance from those people who would potentially benefit the most, namely the emerging markets. But that's another story, and that's actually quite a big task that we've taken on there. And then finally, I've mentioned the trade finance as a funding channel, the distribution initiative, the idea that we can create these very convenient digital packets of information and distribute them to the likes of hedge funds, and new non-bank investors. There are an increasing number of trade finance funds being set up. Some of them, because they recognize the safety of trade, they like the pickup as opposed to cash. But one of the problems, not the only one, but one of the big ones is education and understanding of the underlying product. So repackaging these underlying products into notes actually is tremendously helpful. It deals with settlement as well, as I've already mentioned. I think the final slide here is one that we can move to. So these areas that we're focusing on, the electronic signatures and DNI. DNI, of course, is what we're going to talk about more today. There, the need is to exchange digital for paper. The first one, electronic signatures. I mentioned that all of this really hangs together as one piece. In other words, it's a weakest link scenario, because you can have a particular instrument that's effective in 3 out of the 4 features that it needs to work properly, but then the last one, it might be the simplest one, falls apart. In electronic signatures, that actually in the UK is not an issue. In other countries, it is. We've mentioned here the DNI initiative as one of the ways we're approaching that. I think it's also worth mentioning here, a number of you, I think, will probably have received our very popular guidance on e-signatures that we issued a couple of weeks into the lockdown in March. We also worked with ICC and BAFT on another paper dealing with interim solutions. A lot of those were around these signatures. As Lars will show you later on, the Inigio Trace Original has an inbuilt electronic signature. Digital visible lading and cloud computing and the TFDI I've already really talked about. I'll pass back to you, Andre. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for sharing the bigger picture and the ambition around DNI initiative and the TERA task force. Indeed, this is the result of months of work and also not only technology work, but also legal work. We have a full document that we developed in partnership with Sullivan around the DNI initiative. Some additional info on both the DNI initiative and the TERA task force from a technology integration perspective. I think what we're doing, it takes a very pragmatic approach. We're not trying to change what is working already. I've spent personally 24 years at Swift, and I know how valuable that network is in terms of connecting not only the large banks, but also the smaller banks, also the corporates when they want to use that network. I know how e-banking is critical and B2B platforms as well. So existing technology as well as new technology, such as we're going to hear from Levanter, from TradeStream, all of those need to be considered when trying to address one pain point of digitizing negotiable instruments. So what we're doing with the DNI initiative is focusing on the document. It could be a guarantee, it could be a bill of exchange, a promissory note, a bill of lading, or other type of data sets that need to be authenticated and pass from one party to the other. So with the DNI initiative, we on the back of the Inigio technology, we're really focusing on that piece of, or that pain point and that piece of technology that is integrated or can be integrated into existing channels, systems, and processes. So we're not trying to change what is working well, because changing what is working well is too costly. That would never work. This is for pre-crisis innovators. I think since a few years now, focus is on addressing short-term or delivering short-term value propositions at the best cost efficiency rate. So basically, as you see on this chart, we focusing on a digital document technology backed by a DLT, a distributed ledger-based notary service that will track across the industry the life cycle of the document. But of course, for data privacy reasons, that does not include any data from the document itself. The document is represented by a file. Any system, front to back office system, any platform can handle files. That's a basic function and is as basic now as it is about handling a piece of paper. So that's the same logic we are here replicating. And again, this file can be exchanged over e-banking, over trading platforms, potentially consortiums around the other DLT propositions, as well as Swift, which, let's face it, connects the whole industry and is best at reusing here. Or alternatives to Swift, because some of you are involved in consortiums like Contour or so on, that might emerge hopefully in the future as well. So being compatible with the existing environment is key. As an example, what we're going to focus on today during the TradeStream presentation is how this is achievable for financial institutions. If you zoom on one particular financial institution, I mean, of course, this is a simplistic picture, because in reality, it is actually far more complex and usually unreadable. But so we've tried here to make it readable. And as you can see here, whether the flow is coming from clients or from correspondents, the purpose of additional technology to handle, for instance, bills of exchange or guarantees or other types of trade documents can be handled through a trace original file that you see with the logo here. It can get into the e-banking, into the trade finance application, whether you're working on a proprietary system or a leading application like the big vendors we know of. All of those technologies can handle that file and rely on a public DLT that is providing the industry-wide lifecycle tracking of those documents. In this case, it could be indeed a negotiable instrument such as a bill of exchange. Now, again, one technology is successful when it's very specialized and addressing one pain point. And the purpose here of the DNI initiative is to address the digitization of negotiable instruments, but that doesn't indeed leave aside the other technologies. As I mentioned, the trade finance core application is key and remains as such. We'll just integrate a file rather than a paper original. And another technology that we will talk about, TradeStream, for instance, in this case, will actually continue to play its key role of processing the document, checking that all the rules are compliant according to UCP, ISBP, and so on. And rather than taking in a paper to be OCR'd, such a tool like TradeStream will actually digest immediately a structured electronic document and perform its compliance and processing capabilities on the electronic stream rather than digitizing a paper. So I think it's, again, showing that this pragmatic approach of keeping in place what is working well on the channel side, on the core application side, and on the trade processing side is important. And this is how technology integrates. In May, we already demoed an integration of that technology with one of the trade finance application vendors, China Systems in particular. You can replay that webinar where the detailed process of integration those two technologies has been demoed. So I think this is a very pragmatic approach because in terms of cost efficiency, this is optimal actually. Now, in terms of going beyond the technology proposition and making sure that those digital originals are recognized by the various regulators, we have indeed, as Sean introduced, the task force, TERA, whereby we are tracking the regulatory status of digital negotiable instruments. You see in this second column, we're looking at the specific legislation in place that are providing sometimes hurdles for digitization and that require amendments, adjustment in order to allow for digital originals. So we are tracking down the status, not only for digital negotiable instruments, but also the other instruments that, or areas or issues that Sean introduced across a series of countries. And this is what we're going to review today also on the 4 countries, as you can see on the agenda. So the way we're trying to collect this information, and we have worked with some of you already so far, and we'll go back to additional people in the ITFA community going forward, is we're trying per country to assess the situation for each of those 5 areas in terms of is digital accepted or not? Are there early discussions, or are we aiming to having the regulation adjusted? So what is the status of ongoing talks? What are the specific legislations we have to look at? And who are banks actually working with, banking associations, central banks, which government entities? It's always highly specific to each country. So with this, we believe we can develop a heat map of regulatory advocacy efforts across those 5 areas. So with this now, I'd like to invite David Fry, CEO of Levanter, to provide his perspective as a funding platform with regards to the digitizations of bill of exchange, following which we will hear from TradeStream about their technology integration as a trade document processing platform. Dave, over to you.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Sean. Good morning, everyone. Good evening, people in Asia. I am Dave Fry. I'm the CEO of Levantor. This is a hugely important initiative for us, and one that we're very, very happy to be involved with. What we do, we have a very specific focus at Levantor. We're a fintech that is focused on what we call sales finance. Which is really working closely with major multinational vendors to enable them to offer their large buying partners, distributors, retailers, and customers more flexibility on payment terms. And really why bills of exchange are so important for us is it's the perfect instrument for many reasons. But really what we're trying to do is make it easy for buyers and sellers on a weekly batch of invoices to just very quickly and simply agree that payment can be made typically 60, 90 days later. And so we use bills of exchange in most of what we do. We have a very large panel of funding banks that are very, very comfortable with bills of exchange. This year, we're on track to probably do more than about $2 billion equivalent of this type of transaction. And really, it's a lot of the points that Sean mentioned that are very key here. You know, the very well-defined legal framework for bills of exchange, the fact that it's consistent across so many markets makes it much easier for us to work with than say contract law, going country by country. And you know, that point on negotiability is crucial. Being able to ensure that for all of our flows across border, that you know, people can get comfortable very quickly with the enforceability, the validity of the claims, as well as the negotiability. So for us, moving from paper-based bills of exchange, which we use now, to digital bills of exchange has for a long time been right at the top of the priority list. We certainly need this for scalability. You know, it hasn't presented a deal killer for us yet, but you know, we want to basically take out of the equation the transit of bills of exchange, the need for the buyer, the seller, to actually put a wedding signature on there. And you know, as companies themselves start to digitize their invoicing processes, you know, we're getting more inquiries from them about how can we basically align our financing seamlessly within their e-invoicing processes, both on the seller side as well as on the buyer side. And then, you know, mixed blessing, but I think, you know, the lockdown responses to coronavirus have pushed this to the top of the agenda. In some ways, it's made what we do a little bit more difficult, but it has, I think, you know, forced everybody to realize that, you know, we can't continue to put this digitization of bills of exchange off, because, you know, this type of stuff can really cause a lot of disruption in that weekly process of signing. So you know, it's a very critical part for our business. You know, but we recognize the challenges. You know, we recognize that the banks, you know, have a lot of work to do on getting comfortable with the legal framework for digital bills of exchange. And so in the meantime, you know, we've come up with, you know, a number of fixes for it that have allowed us to continue to grow. You know, hybrid types of solutions that work on specific cases. But, you know, for us, finding a way for the market to get comfortable with digital, truly digital bills of exchange would, you know, would be a huge game changer. So I think that, you know, short and sweet, that's kind of where we stand on it, Andre.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, very good to hear from you as both as a user and a technology player, how critical this digitization objective is. And indeed, rather than just focusing on the technology itself, we definitely put much emphasis on the legal aspects. We have released indeed a contract law-based solution in April, but we know this will get us that far. We need also work with the regulatory side authorities to enable such technology to be used as part of the common law. And this is exactly what Sean is leading in the UK in particular. We will hear more about progress there. And this is done jointly with ICC UK. So thank you very much indeed, Dave, for your insights. Let's hear now from another technology provider, but more on the back office side, I should say, with TradeStream and Sam. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andre. Thank you to you and Sean and ITFA for giving us this opportunity to speak on this forum. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody on the call. So what's TradeStream? TradeStream is a company that was set up a few years ago. Most of us are ex-bankers from the financing industry. And we wanted to reimagine trade, if you will, digitally. Because as you know, trade is one of those businesses which has not changed for decades, probably centuries. It's extremely paper-based, it's extremely cumbersome, very visible, very, very painful for all the parties that are involved. And in some form, that is restrictive for the people around because it's so difficult and cumbersome. It's very repetitive. So rather than the processing being a chore, which it is today, and paper being the backbone of that processing, we thought, what if we were to reimagine that entire flow? And what if data was at the center of existence as opposed to paper? And if there was a way in which you could use technology tools that are available today to be able to move around data to allow that processing, and thereabout all the other processes in the form of the compliance checks, in the form of financing, in the form of insurance, etc., to work off that data flow as opposed to paper. And if we had to do that, what sort of technologies would be available that can help it make happen? So we started this journey, and it's been a fascinating journey for us, as we've seen over the last few years as technology has played, it's been amazing, the sort of technology tools that are available today. And along the way, we've had to look back at each and every step of the trade process, which is today a given, and thought to ourselves whether that step is really necessary in the 21st century. Because a lot of these processes per se were probably set up much, much earlier when the power of technology was not available. So to rethink those processes and see if those processes are needed, and if they are indeed needed, then could it be done digitally as opposed to manual the way it is being done today? And the idea is to be able to move the trade process forward so that humans are actually elevated. They're taken into more thinking as opposed to just doing mundane jobs, and so that the process becomes a lot more efficient and painless for the people involved in the industry. The good thing is, and the good news is, that technology can make that happen. And I'll show it to you in the next few slides as to how we are step by step moving the dial on from a technology point of view, and how the DNI initiative links in very well with the technology dial move that we are seeing per se. So if you move to the next slide, Andre, this is a slide which I think we're all very, very comfortable with. This is what you learn in trade as you go. The 4-box model, the seller, the buyer, the seller's bank, and the buyer's bank. We're all very familiar with it. So contractually, the seller and the buyer agree to a certain contract. They obviously need to depend on their banks. The seller for the bank in his own country, the buyer on the bank on his own country, because it's a globalized model. So you want the seller's bank to be able to check. The seller wants his documents to be checked by his bank so that he's certain that the buyer's bank will pay. The buyer's bank wants to ensure that the payment that it makes on behalf of the buyer is actually against genuine flows and genuine transactions. And this rudimentary flow at the bedrock is supporting almost $20 trillion worth of global trade. I mean, probably this year it'll be different for various reasons, but overall it's $20+ trillion globally that supports this underlying elementary flow. And the problem is, it's not the buyer and the seller or the evolution that businesses have gone through, but this fundamental process which nets all these constituencies together has predominantly remained paper. I mean, at one stage in one of the surveys, it showed that less than 3% of the processes between the banks and the buyer and the corporates have actually been automated. Now that shows the amount of paper that's floating around and how painful it is for all the people around to be able to operate. Not just that, I mean, when you join a bank or a corporate, as we did so many years ago, You go in and you are on the operating floor, you learn, you get trained, and then most of your learning is on the floor. And when you retire, that learning walks away with you outside, and you never ever are able to give it off institutionally to somebody else. So there are a lot of problems that are basically that the current process is fraught with, and therefore, Andre, if you move to the next slide, please. What we looked at TradeStream was basically to look at the entire process and reimagine it digitally. So the first step for us was that if we were to have a systemic approach, a systematic approach, what would we do? The system would probably comprise of a digitization channel, because like it or not, paper is not disappearing tomorrow morning. I mean, there'll be vestiges of paper probably 5, 7, 10 years from now as well. So there will be this part paper, part digital process. So we had to basically, first of all, make our platform flexible so that it could take paper as well as digital inputs. But if you were to assume paper is going to be the mainstay for the next few years, we needed a process to be able to digitize it. So digitize and take the data out of the documents so that it's data that is flowing thereafter and not the paper. So to do that, we had to use what's called OCR, or optical character readers, or IVR, intelligent character readers, which basically have the ability to be able to pick up the data, glean, and make sense of it. Now, the OCR technology is not very new. It's been there for at least 25, 30 years. But what's new, or what's unprecedented, is the need in trade. I mean, we in the trade industry know that when you check a trade document, you need to be able to pick up between 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 data elements. It's different from picking up 8 or 9 data elements from a visiting card. So the OCR technology had to really improve, really ratchet up so that when you scan a piece of paper, the system has the ability to discern between a bill of lading and a bill of exchange. It has the ability to reorient itself so that it can pick up the data from that specific bill of exchange or bill of lading and then pocket it intelligently while making the corrections. So that's the first step of the TradeStream process. The second step, once you've got the data, and you've got a high level of accuracy of picking the data, was to be able to check it and check it in an automated manner. So all the UCP rules, the ISBP rules, and all the rules that we know all over the world with trade had to be somehow managed on the platform, not just in a hard-coded manner, but in a flexible manner so that you can keep on appending it. As new regulations come out, as new rules come out, as you encounter new documents, rules keep on increasing. At this stage, for example, we have on the platform close to about 300,000 different algorithms, which have the ability to discern between the buyer and the seller, the bank, the industry, the country, and make intelligent sense of the underlying data that's been gleaned out of the documents. So you take out the data of the documents and then you run it through the rules, which are basically giving you the response as to whether the documents are clean or not. And it goes through a very, very comprehensive set of checks to ensure that the documents are clean. While doing so, it hands it over to the third step in the TradeStream process, which is basically giving the data off to various accredited very, very, very good partners in the industry, people who check for compliance, people who check for the vessel, people who check for the voyage, people who basically check for whether there is an OFAC sanction or if there is a dual use in the underlying goods, etc. So the entire end-to-end purpose is to digitize it, to check it for trade, and then to various third parties ensure that the transaction is kosher and all that comes back to as a user in the matter of minutes. At this stage, I'm delighted to share with you that we are checking documents in about 25, 28 minutes. And over a period of time, systematically have a line of sight to be able to bring it down to first to sub 20 minutes, then 10 minutes, and probably even to sub 5 minutes of document checking. So that was basically what the TradeStream platform was for us to be able to check it online real time for our customers, which is predominantly banks. But then while speaking to banks, what we realized was, guess what? The source of the documents is corporates. So if corporates are checking those documents first, shouldn't the platform be given to them so that they can check the documents, clean them up before the documents are sent to the bank? So we, with our banking partners and friends around the world, have now taken it to the corporates, where we are actually getting corporates to be able to embrace the TradeStream platform and check the documents at source. You see the two green boxes, the corporate and the bank basically checking those documents. While doing so about 12 months ago, we realized that, if, for example, the documents are being checked by the corporate and the documents are being checked by the bank, it's still a dot dash process, because if the corporate checks its documents and then has to willy-nilly print it and courier it across to the bank, that defeats the purpose, because you've made it digital, and guess what? You're not transforming it and making it in paper again, analog again, and you give it to the bank. So working with, again, some very good partners in the industry and ourselves, we built out tools where we can actually connect between the corporate and the bank And you can do it digitally. You can do it through a blockchain solution. For example, we have on TradeStream, there are certain other partners that we work with that allow the same thing as well. But the idea is basically to be able to take the data from the corporate and give it to the bank so that both the corporate and the bank can partake of the same data and check it in real time. And if you do that, it becomes really, really powerful because paper has not gone through. You're not subject to the vagaries of logistics, and especially so now with the virus, etc. When logistics is really broken, you basically work off data and take decisions intelligently, safely in the corporate and in the bank per se. The final step of our journey was basically the API technology, and the API technology is really fascinating. The more you get to know it, the more you see how it can be a sort of connector for the various parties in the industry. So with the API protocols, we are now connecting with various third parties that corporates deal with, for example, logistic partners, insurance partners, SWIFT, ERPs, etc. And as you do that, you can actually start making the physical documents that the corporates get, third-party document set, you can actually make that digital as well. So where all of this is trending is basically that you would, as a corporate, ideally get your documents digitally. Once you've got it digitally, you check it online on the platform. When you check it online, you're able to hand it off to the bank in a digital, safe, secure, seamless manner. The bank gets the data and is able to check it on the platform. So from source to finish, you're basically digital, and paper is not the reason why the process is inefficient. And I'm happy to share with you with all the technologies that are available today in the form of OCRs, AI and machine learning, in the form of neural networks, image recognition, reverse image recognition, Sean mentioned cloud technology and APIs, obviously. This is moving very, very quickly to what would be a digital piping for the industry. The reason why the DNI initiative really resonated with us was because if you look at the underlying documents set of the corporates, the two documents which are probably the hardest to handle are probably the bills of exchanges and the bills of lading. And the reason for that is because they are title documents. They are financial documents, title documents, or transport documents, and therefore they need to be dealt very, very carefully because it's one thing checking an invoice. It's a totally different thing checking for a bill of exchange, which can actually possibly be fraudulent. It can possibly be used for dual financing. So the antecedents for that instrument, the source origin of that instrument is very, very critical. So working with partners like NAGO, working with partners like Bolero, it is really heartening for us because then we can go back and confirm to you that the bill of exchange is actually genuine. We can go back and confirm to you the bill of lading is genuine. And therefore the end-to-end process is not just about checking, but it's also about ensuring that checks like dual financing or checks of the authenticity of the underlying instruments is ensured. So in summary, where do we stand? I think we are really, really excited because, there's a saying that may you live in exciting times or interesting times, and these are definitely interesting times. I mean, for us at TradeStream, the number of pilots, implementations, and the corporates that you're dealing with around the world is really, really wonderful. We're meeting people who are like-minded, passionate in various institutions who are driving this process of change in the trade industry, which is probably we needed for the last, I don't know how many years it's needed that change. Some would call it an evolution, some would call it a revolution, but trade's going through that tectonic shift as we speak at the moment. And probably in the next 2 to 3 years, in fact, without a modicum of doubt, I think the trade industry is going to look very, very different. What's really been heartening is how the ITFA senior leadership with Sean and Andre have taken on the regulatory piece, because as Sean said, underpinning all of this is also the regulation, the laws that need to change to make digital technology happen. And on that note, the number of calls that have happened to the regulators around the world and the sort of support that we've seen from them in making this possible and embracing. I mean, something as dogged as the Bills of Exchange Act 1882, 140 years and counting, not changed. The lawmakers are now saying that they want to make shifts to it, changes to it, so that they can actually take it into the digital era. I think those are very, very heartening, and that's causing this entire process to accelerate. New pipelines are being laid as we speak today, and in the next 2 3 years, we're going to see a very, very different, a totally different trade industry as we speak. I'd like to end by saying that there's a saying that the best way to predict the future is to make it happen. And what's been really delightful in the last few years in the industry has been to see how the industry is rallying itself, and people are really working day in, day out to make this possible so that we head towards a much, much better and safer trade industry. That's it from me. Thank you so much, Andre. Back to you.
Thank you, Sam. It really shows how technologies coexist and integrate with each other. Indeed, the API here at step number 2, assuming you have a digital bill of exchange, indeed, recognized by regulators under common law, which is the ideal solution, but in the meantime could be contract law. This API is actually replacing indeed the paper process, the need for OCR, and the key functions, the core function of StraightStream remain as important. So that's what we're doing with the fintech initiatives within ITFA, is making sure those various technologies integrate conceptually, but also in practice. And that the legal aspects and regulatory aspects get aligned. And we know that's where often the challenge is in terms of the timeline. But we're gonna hear more now. Thank you, Dave and Sam, for getting us through the value propositions and the technology integration. Let's hear now from Lars, Lucas, Sam, and Sean about the country-specific efforts on the regulatory side. So with this, I'd like to hand over to Lars to get us the latest status on Sweden. Lars, over to you.
Thank you, Andre. Trying to keep this a little bit brief. I'll just walk through these bullets. And generally speaking, we love digital in our region, in the Nordics. And we've been very, very blessed because the banks agreed to create a common standard for digital signatures with good quality. And this was also supported by the governments. Unfortunately, we didn't have the same standard for all Nordic countries. So Sweden has one, Denmark has one, and etc. But this means that we perform most of our businesses using digital signatures. We sign our tax returns, etc., etc. There are some, regarding signatures, there are some areas where there's still some uncertainty, and that's, for instance, real estate transaction, etc. But within trade, digital signatures are accepted and valid, and there's absolutely no question about that. When we come to negotiable instruments, we are so blessed in Sweden that we have a Supreme Court decision where the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that the legislation in Sweden is technology neutral. That's number one. And any technical solution, any digital solution that will cater for the safety mechanisms that the lawmaker intended to have when he wrote the law, if that's catered for in new technology, then that is accepted under Swedish law. If you can have, for a negotiable instrument, if you can show possession, if it's transferable, if you can show singularity, etc., these are valid instruments in the Kingdom of Sweden. Now, there is still, a Supreme Court is a Supreme Court, but then government institutions need to adapt to this, and I think that we are in the process of adaptability because new technology takes a little bit of time to implement also in the government institutions. But I think we're on our way to actually have negotiable instruments fully accepted within Sweden. And the key players are, of course, the banks, the corporates, and the government. Having said that, if a negotiable instrument is accepted, so is an instrument of title. So documents of title are covered by the Supreme Court decision, according to our legal advisors. And they're also used, of course, because companies use Bolero and Estox, etc. When it comes to cloud-based document processing, I think the jury is still out there, depending on how you process documents, because we really want to keep information. We don't want to spread information anywhere and any way, and we have legislation where we need to keep some of the customer data within either EU or within other regions. The advantage that we have with our solution, the trace original solution, is that the customer information is contained in the document, in the file, and it's not put on the cloud unless the user chooses to store the documents in a cloud solution. But generally speaking, cloud processing is moving forward extremely rapidly in Sweden and in the Nordic area. When you think about trade financing and funding, it's still the traditional banks that are the major funders, and I think that there's probably quite a bit of appetite to introduce alternative funding strategies here.
Okay, very good, Lars. So this is the Nordics, as often, very advanced on the use of digital solutions. Let's indeed look at how the hurdles will be addressed. The outstanding hurdles will be addressed in the coming months. Moving on, thank you, Lars. Let's focus on Singapore with Samuel, and I will share Samuel's separate document. There you are, Samuel.
Thank you. Thank you, Andre. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. First of all, let me just hope and pray that all of you and your loved ones are really safe in these unprecedented times that we are living in. We in Singapore just last week went from out of the circuit breaker, so life is slowly getting back to normal, and hopefully it will continue to do so. All right, I have 3 slides, and I'll really focus on one, and being the only banker, I think, or there are some ex-bankers on the call here, but I will try and paint a slightly different perspective. Next slide, please, Andre. Thank you. You know, you have actually coincidentally, Samir had the same diagram that I have here on the left. This is just setting context. To my mind, you know, what is stopping us? I mean, there is obviously incorporation into the legal aspects, and you know, all of us, all of the speakers spoke about it. That's one, and I'll speak about it a little bit in the Singapore context. But really, I think legal or regulation or law will stop at the functional equivalence side. So I think the real challenge is to establish or find a way to establish functional equivalence to the paper world when it comes to negotiable bills or when it comes to title bills, right? When it is less important paper, and I'm not saying contracts are less important, but you know, the countries have found a way, or laws have found a way to get it done. And as you'll see when I go to the subsequent slides. So really, when it comes to functional equivalence, how do you prove single ownership? So in a physical world, it is if I'm holding the negotiable bill or the bill of lading, you know, I own the title to it, technically speaking, and legally that is accepted. What is the digital equivalence? How do you prove that, right? Second, you know, by passing the bill to you, Andre, I'm passing the title to you, transferability. How do you really prove that and ensure it is unique, both in terms of title and in terms of the transfer in the digital paradigm? And because it is digital, obviously security comes in. Now, the way MLETR, or United Nations model of electronic transfer, defined it when they came up with it back in 2017, and they basically said, look, you can achieve functional equivalence if there is a reliable method to identify the electronic record, and it is subject to control from creation till it ceases in the digital world. And I think Sean used the term digital equivalence. And then it can, you know, the method can also retain the integrity. And if you look at these 3 things, and I think the countries are working on incorporating this into law, and we'll shortly look at the Singapore example. But there are really, in my mind, 2 ways to do it. You really need to have a title registry. Either it is a it is a central title registry or it's a decentralized title registry that becomes interoperable. We are far away from, I think, the second one. We will eventually get there. Baby steps are being taken. So as a result, what you see in the market is really central title registries around closed loops or clubs. So if you look at Bolero, SDocs, these are all good title registries, but relying on a pre-agreed contract between the participants, and the title registry is central to that contract. And a platform like Contour, which is an industry initiative, tries to connect these various parties, and we are also members of that. Obviously, the ITFA, ePayment, EPU, I needn't speak about that. That's also an initiative in terms of the digital native payment undertaking. So that's the context in terms of what functional equivalence, how do we prove ownership, how do we unique single ownership, how do you, or title, how do you prove transfer, keep it unique. You need a registry, or you need an equivalent of that to prove that. Once you achieve that functional equivalence, I think the laws will be able to address the rest of it. Let's move on to the next slide, please, Andre, if I may. You can skip this one. This is about Singapore. I couldn't, not talk about my beautiful country, but we'll skip on from that. So where are we? So Singapore was one of the first countries to enact the ETA. So in most common law-based jurisdictions, you'll find there are three pieces of legislation. There will be the Negotiable Instruments Act, or the Bill of Exchange Act. There'll be a Bill of Lading Act, and there'll be an Electronic Transactions Act that would have been put in place in the recent decade or so, right? The last 10 years or so. So Singapore has all three. We were one of the first to adopt or implement the Electronic Transactions Act, adopting the model law of electronic commerce from Ministry Tribunal back in 1998. And there were three principles in that ETA, which I thought was pretty advanced for its time. A, that it will be non-discriminatory, i.e. just because an electronic document, let's say your contract, is in digital form or electronic form, it will not be discriminated against. It will have the same legal validity. Second, functional equivalence. Electronic records or communications are treated as fulfilling a traditional paper-based requirement. Three, it did not impose any technological neutrality, or rather technological biases. So as long as you can achieve these, whichever technology you are employing, email or PDF or whatever it is, works. However, there was a big exception. It stopped short of applying the scope of the ETA to negotiable instruments and title documents, i.e. let's say property transactions, bills of lading, bills of exchange, promissory notes were excluded from the ETA, right? But other than that, right? So today we can, in Singapore, you can agree a contract digitally, and there's no need for wet signatures. So various documents, as long as it is not negotiable instruments or title documents, you can actually execute it digitally. And what is interesting has been the law has been there for a while. Uptake has been, I would say, nascent, but the current crisis that we're all going through, COVID-19, has actually pushed the envelope on that. So we have seen, personally for our bank, the bank I work for, Standard Chartered, we have seen a huge uptake and a huge set of clients moving on to basically electronic ways of submitting at least instructions where there's no title or where there's no negotiation involved, like an instruction to issue a letter of credit, for example, moving completely electronic, either onto a proprietary platform or simple emails. So that's the context. And the IMDA, which is the Infocom Media Development Authority of Singapore, and we have a few representatives from them, from that body on the call today. Thank you guys for joining in. So they did a public consultation back in June 19 last year to see how the ETA can be improved. And in summary, I think two of the things that came back was the exclusions of the negotiable and title instruments should ideally be done away with. And it should continue, the whole ETA should continue to be technology neutral, which is great. I think both of those were fantastic recommendations and public feedback. However, to do that, it can't be a sudden turn on the switch. So in the recommendation, one of the things IMDA included was to have a sunrise period till 2021, so sometime next year, and then incorporate it into the ETA, i.e. incorporate negotiable bills, title documents, all the earlier exclusions we had, let it be incorporated into the legislation or into the Electronic Transactions Act. And with the objective that at least for government transactions like buying a property here in Singapore, for example, could be conducted digitally by 2023. So that's the ambition and that's the plan. Now, what that means is obviously we need to, all of this is applicable if it addresses, the laws apply if we can address the 2 points I started with earlier, which is the functional equivalence on proving that there is a single holder and the transfer was kosher, and across various transfers in the sequence, the integrity is maintained, right? And as I was saying earlier, the solutions out there are mostly closed loop cloud-based or club solutions. So IMDA has been working on a framework called Trade Trust, an initiative to try and see whether we can actually have peer-to-peer digital transfer and make it interoperable. So Trade Trust is a framework that relies on a decentralized registry. We have just done the IMD has done a POC recently. It is a collaboration between the IMD in Singapore and the Maritime and the Port Authority to try and see whether the digital negotiable instruments or the title documents, i.e. EBL, could be transferred peer-to-peer digitally in an interoperable manner between the various clubs, right? For example, let's say between SDocs and Bolero as an example. And that's the aim. So that there's work happening there. There's a proof of concept / pilot that has been done. And we're going to have a separate session with the IMD, and some of you from the ITF will be involved to hear about it firsthand from them. The IMD is also working with the United Nations CFACT, which has a working group to look at exactly this MLETR compliant transfer working group to address the digital interoperability of these title transfer instruments, right? How do you come up with a standard that will allow to establish the functional equivalence, i.e. if somebody is turning up with, as a bank, what we're struggling with today is, unless I join the different clubs, I am not sure I'll be able to take a digital instrument and present it in a court of law as being unique across various clubs or various ecosystems or various digital islands. So in summary, I think Singapore was one of the first. Electronic signatures, cloud governance, electronic contract signing is all allowed today, and the legal legislation is pretty well established. Negotiable instrument and title documents were not traditionally included in the scope of that, but the IMD has actually already recommended, and we have a timeline. The country is moving towards that. Hopefully by next year, we should have that in legislation if things go well. Provided the functional equivalence can be met, I think we should be able to see it happen, make it happen in Singapore, working together with IMDA and the industry partners. Let me just stop there and hand it back over to you, Andre.
Thank you very much, Samuel. This is very promising indeed to seeing the regulatory activity since 1998. Indeed, I think we have the right context there for progressing the implementations or the additional regulatory decisions. I will try now to go back to my deck. Here, there we are. And so that we can move on to the next country. We're moving back to Europe with Spain. Lucas, over to you.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you, Itza, for inviting me to explain about the situation in Spain. Good morning, evening, and afternoon, everybody. So, just to put a little bit of color about what's the situation, the regulatory situation, and the environment in Spain. Little background: the Spain is a country with full plenty of SMEs. It's 3.5 million. SMEs in Spain, but the SMEs that you are allowed to work with in Europe, they are not the type of SMEs that we have in Spain. They are micro SMEs. So the way that they interact between themselves, between the banks, between the government, the tax authorities, it's very complex. So this is one of the first countries that they adopt, and it was pushed by the government, the electronic signature, and it breaks down to the regulatory environment that they are, but for what reason they are friendly with the use of this of electronic relationship between the stakeholders. So nowadays in Spain, if you said little company, little startup, it's mandatory that all your relationships with any public institution has to be with a digital signature. You cannot do it on paper. So this is the important focus to see where they are, or where we are in Spain in the use of the technology. But there is a but. The use on the negotiable instruments, especially in the promissory notes, that in Spain it's well established as one of the best finance instrument that these micro SMEs they have to finance themselves. They are going with their paper promissory notes, and it's on the banks to move forward in this kind of digitalization, and they are afraid, obviously, of the enforceability of these instruments. So where we are, we're in the proof of concept, because with the check of the current regulatory environment, it's nothing that it implies any barrier to use that. But obviously, the players want to see if it works or it's not working. And at this stage, we are making this proof of concept with these solutions. Okay, because at the end of the day, the market, all the banks are collaborating in a kind of, let's say, an association, that they are bringing all the unpaid promissory notes that they have, and they are collaborating together in getting all these unpaid receipts. And we have the framework to realize that the use of a full digital instrument that could be negotiable, that could be enforceable, that it's the most important thing, will be something that could be interesting. So my bet is, as we are succeeding with this proof of concept, the banks for sure will be the enabler of the use of the technology, and the government openness to adapt, if necessary, anything under regulatory, as they did when it was necessary for them to interact with these thousands or millions of SMEs. It's something that it will for sure have a good acceptance in terms of government. Okay, and I get back. We are just starting with this initiative, but for the rest of the verticals, we are almost in the same way. Okay.
Thank you, Lucas.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for making the time. Also, not easy for you. You're on your way, and good to know you're also leading those regulatory discussions there in Spain. Moving on, we have Sean with the activities in the UK. Sean, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andre, and thanks to also my panelists for that interesting roundup. So it's a very varied picture. In the UK, I've already sort of trailed this. We have been, there's been a lot of activity recently. Just before this webinar, I tried to find out actually what the state of play is with quite a major proposal that we made with the ICC to number 10, to 10 Downing Street, to actually get this fast-tracked by the government. And again, government here means a number of different people, but we've managed to round them all up. The starting point, I'm not sure how well you can see this letter, but the starting point with the change of the law, of course, is in speaking to the Law Ministry, the Ministry of Justice in the UK. This letter, if you can read it, I'll just tell you, is supportive of what we're doing. I've already mentioned that really a lot of the issues here are really legal and not technical. I think as Lars has shown and Sam has shown, you know, the technology is there. In some cases, it's been there for a long time. The commercial need is there, as David has shown, and other countries such as Singapore, who are actually a real pioneer in this area, and I take my hat off to them, have already, you know, moved very fast. Do I have a second slide here for the different? Yeah, so just looking at some of the different areas. So I've already mentioned, you know, some of the issues and the sort of the weakest link problem that we have, which is that you can take a particular trade finance instrument. It could be a bill of lading, or a bill of exchange, and you can get nearly there, and then you fall over at the last hurdle. Now, in the case of negotiable instruments, this problem is around negotiability, about transfer, and this is something that we can deal with by amending the Bills of Exchange Act 1882. I mean, when I explain that our law in the UK depends on an act that's 140 years old, I get a lot of laughter often. But actually, it's an extremely well drafted act. It was, in fact, updated a few years ago to deal precisely with one of the technologies that Sam mentioned, OCR recognition, OCR processing, in this case, OCR processing of personal checks. So that required actually a change to the law. But the way we have identified that the law could be changed and much more easily for negotiable instruments is actually by passing secondary legislation. That's much easier. That will be passed under the Electronic Communications Act of 2000, which will allow a much faster passage through Parliament. Bills of lading we've touched on here. It's not something specifically that we have dealt with in ITFA, but this particular approach to government also includes bills of lading, and there is a change that's possible again through secondary legislation under the Carriage of Goods by Sea Act, which is a 1992 act, a bit more modern, and that actually allows the possibility of by departmental order would be secondary legislation. It allows for the admissibility or the use of electronic systems for bills of exchange, for bills of lading. And I say all of us scratch our heads and wonder why it hasn't been done already, but maybe now is the time. So the UK overall has got a very beneficial environment, a very permissive environment, and it's worth, in relation to electronic signatures, it's worth just spending sort of a few seconds on that, because we have the European legislation that's in place, EIDAS, and that will remain in place after Brexit happens at the end of this year. But actually, we already had pre-existing legislation, the Electronic Communications Act, and in fact, even under the common law, in many cases, electronic signatures would have been permitted. And it's really important. And again, I go back to this point about it's different in every country. In some countries, you find that you don't need to pass new laws, that the existing law works perfectly well. And it sometimes, it depends what you want it to do. And one of the interesting things that we found recently with electronic signatures within ITFA, I mentioned our guidance that we issued right at the beginning of the lockdown. That was really meant to be temporary. We really wanted, better legislative solutions to be put in place. But actually what we're finding is that a lot of you are very happy with those interim solutions. The law works perfectly well in many countries. And a very interesting webinar that we did with our German regional committee a couple of weeks ago, where we had a couple of Brits, it was taking part. It was clear that whilst the Germans wanted much more formal legislation to be put in place, the Brits were actually quite happy with the sort of common law and having what we call simple digital signatures. So things that don't need to be approved by third parties. You don't need digital certificates. So that's quite an interesting divide. Many countries don't, of course, have that pre-existing permissive law, so they don't have that fertile environment that we have here. Even so, for a lot of trade, what you need is certainty. There is, even for negotiable instruments, there was a case that could have been made that actually you could transfer these in electronic form. That was a very difficult argument legally, and we don't want to be in a situation, as it's been pointed out. These are these are valuable instruments. They're, in the case of bills of lading, documents of title. In the case of negotiable instruments, they are proof of debts. So you don't want any doubt about that whatsoever. Sadly involved in some of the commodity frauds that have been taking place in Singapore recently, and I can tell you it is so important that you have a valid and enforceable bill of lading to get your securities. And nobody wants to take any risk on this, hence the approach to the government. Very simple solutions, In the meantime, we haven't really spent a lot of time in this webinar talking about it, but I say in ITFA, we always try and come up with practical solutions. On the negotiable instruments side, our paper, our guide to digital negotiable instruments contains an interim contractual solution. And I say interim, maybe in inverted commas, because maybe people will be happy with it and adopt it long term. But I think, given that trade is cross-border by definition, and it needs to be pretty simply understood when these documents pass borders, we really do want to change the law. And I'm very hopeful that actually the government has taken up our proposal. I'll leave it there, Andre.
Thank you. And we know how important change in the UK would be in terms of possible ripple effects on other countries. Thank you, Sean, as well as Lars, Lucas, and Samuel for this update on regulatory advocacy in your countries. We are working on additional countries, of course, and we'll keep on updating you on the progress of the TERA task force in other countries. So feel free to continue to update us on those countries and others, of course, as you see regulatory talks progressing or papers issued. We are happy to provide a global perspective, and we want to continue filling in those heat maps, as you saw, on the 5 areas, not only on negotiable instruments, in order to provide the membership with a global view on the regulatory decisions. I think it's, for regulators, also quite interesting to see what is happening in other countries, and we know they are watching each other and talking to each other. We really want, whether it's a UK, Singapore, Bahrain, who has already implemented UNCTRAL, or Abu Dhabi, who is very active on regulatory advocacy for digital innovations, for instance, on digital assets. We really want to elevate in the market those countries that will progress first, because the need is getting urgent now. And I think there is an opportunity for countries to be the first, indeed, to adapt the regulation to enable digital negotiable instruments. So with this, I'd like to see whether we have any question. We had a comment from Kirsi. I think Kirsi mentioned that in the picture on trade trust and IMDA, Enigio should be mentioned as a solution. So definitely on the Enigio side, I think there is interest for understanding this new framework and how the technology fits within this new framework. Any other question, comment you want to share verbally or via the chat? Feel free to raise your hand, which you can do over the Zoom features, and I can permit you to talk. If we don't have any question, I think I would also offer Sean the opportunity for sharing the next steps, your view on the next steps, although you already covered the contract law solution we have, EPU, and versus the common law advocacy.
Yes, so thank you, Andre. I mean, I think you sort of said it very fully and very eloquently. The purpose really of today was to introduce you to the DNI, to show you what a really powerful tool that is, and how it can be integrated into into platforms and other systems and processes. It is by itself, of course, by itself in a way it means nothing, but it means everything. But you can't have a negotiable instrument, even on the blockchain, that exists in the abstract, that can't be that can't be processed, that can't be sold. So all of these steps are really important. I go back to the point I've made about the weakest link, and sadly, with cross-border trade, you have a very long chain. You have a lot of weak links potentially, and that is an issue. And I mentioned at the beginning the efforts that we've been still making actually, but we've started several years ago at the WTO, where frankly we've had a mixed success in terms of really pushing this agenda, because a lot of these provisions have got into free trade agreements, but that's not enough. As I said, in some countries, India, for example, where you find you have a sort of common law. In fact, the Bills of Exchange Act there is from 1881. For various technical reasons, they got there a year earlier than us, but it's essentially the same act. Of course, these are all acts and law that was left behind by the British Empire. And actually, that's but for what wasn't the British Empire, the French also left very similar laws. So that's why this is an important area where the fruit is really right in front of us. It's so there's such a great opportunity here because we already have, because of the historical record, we already have quite a lot of standardization. People understand bills and promissory notes all across the world. I mentioned that it first started originally when we were set up. We were the IFA, International Forfeiting Association. And one of the reasons that forfeiting back then was, and I actually still think it is, but certainly back then was a very exciting trade finance technique, is that it really did enable you to open up the emerging markets. And here I'm talking about the 80s and the 90s, where there was not so much digitalization, but people saw that you could buy a promissory note or a bill issued or accepted by a company in South America, and it would make sense to bankers in Europe and to investors in Europe. And we've moved on a lot since then, and what we find now is are these weakest link points, which we're trying to solve very hard. And so WTO we thought was a good entry point. The TERA has really been set up to deal with this from a sort of bottoms up approach because of the problems that I've mentioned. That it can be in certain countries you need to speak to a lot of people. In other countries you need to speak to one person. In one country the problem is the law. In another country the problem is practice or it's regulation. And sometimes that's beneficial because regulation, such as circulars from various ministries, can often be passed much more quickly and can be issued much more quickly than passing legislation going through a parliament or the equivalent. So it doesn't have to go through the full scrutiny. And this actually is what we saw in India, I've mentioned, but also in some countries in North Africa. But it's a little bit of a disjointed picture, hence the reason why TERA exists and why we in ITFA want to provide our backing, our library, our resources. We don't have people, sadly, we don't have ITFA employees in every country in the world, unfortunately, so we rely on you, our members, to help us, but we are there as the headquarters and your backers. We're able to assist you both with materials and actually with, where it makes sense, with physical or virtual representation. I'm very pleased, I think on the webinar today, we have representatives from the IMDA, and I say you guys are doing a great job. What's really important is the linkage now. It's regional, should be international. The bigger it is, the more challenging it is, but it's still a prize worth fighting for. So unless there are questions, I see there's some things come in on the chat about, it's a legal question. So maybe I'll take this one if I can, reverting to my day job as a lawyer. So it is about courts of law accepting digital bills of exchange in arbitration. So there, the answer I think is whether it's a court of law or arbitration, what they will look at is the validity of the instrument under the law that's created it. So in certain countries, in certain states in the US, for example, you can have digital negotiable instruments. New York doesn't allow it in at least a particularly obvious way. So if you looked at one of those, that would be valid. But if you looked at a digital negotiable instrument that you had bought in the UK, then there were the problems that I've already mentioned. And you've heard about the problems in Singapore. Sweden clearly is the place to go to. They have great arbitrations, arbitration courts there. But this is really the cross-border law issue, and this is really the long chain problem that we have. That you can have, for example, a promissory note under English law but actually it's submitted to arbitration in, say, Singapore. And this sort of thing actually is very common. And bills of lading, in fact, that have arbitration under they could refer to arbitration under the charter party, and that could be, you know, any number of different countries. But as a basic legal concept, you look back to what the law of the instrument is, not where you are arbitrating or judging on it. So I hope, sorry, that's a little bit of a long answer, typical of a lawyer. But the important thing is the law of the instrument is what we have to get right, and that is not right yet in every significant country in the world for trade for these kinds of instruments.
Thank you, Sean. I see indeed we have no other question. We're coming to the end of this 90-minute session, including indeed 30 minutes of Q&A. Thanks a lot to all of you. We were 60 indeed today to join this session. Thanks to our speakers, Sean, Dave, Sam Segal, Lars, Lucas, Samuel, and Sean again. Yeah, you spoke a few times. You had different roles according to the agenda. Thanks for sharing your expertise. This is very not only exciting but also promising. Looking at the efforts not only on the technology side but also on the regulatory side. We have weekly calls on the TERA task force and monthly webinars. We're going to more and more have country-specific webinars as well with Australia and FCC countries, GCC countries in July. So let's keep in touch to see how we can support your own particular efforts in your region or your country. Have a good evening for those of you in Asia. Good afternoon for those of you in Europe, and have a nice morning for those of you in the US. Thanks very much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Andre.
Dave.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.